The most dangerous places in America do not look dangerous. They look like farmland, mountains, empty highways, small towns. But buried under them are missile fields, nuclear labs, command bunkers, and bomber bases. Places built for one moment only. The worst one. If World War III starts, these states do not get to hide. They get used. First. So which ones are on that list? And which state is so important it almost has to be hit immediately? When people imagine World War III, they picture carriers, oceans, maybe distant cities on the other side of the planet. But America's first real front line may begin at home. Not everywhere, in very specific states. States that hold the machinery of retaliation, and that is what sacrifice means here. Not that Washington stops caring about them, the opposite. These places matter so much that they cannot be pulled back, hidden, or replaced. They stay exposed because the entire system depends on them staying online. This list is not about the biggest population centers. It is about the strategic map, the places that build the weapons, the places that watch the sky, the places that launch back, and the places an enemy would want disabled in the first minutes, not the first months. So let's count them down. From the nuclear brain to the state that may be target number 1. At number 10, New Mexico. This is where the nuclear age first crossed the line from theory to reality. That history never really left. Even now, New Mexico remains tied to the design, testing, and engineering side of America's nuclear enterprise. That matters because wars are not only won by launch crews. They are sustained by the people who build, maintain, and modernize the systems behind the launch crews. If New Mexico goes dark, America does not lose a battlefield. It loses part of the brain behind the arsenal. And the unsettling part is how ordinary the surrounding landscape feels. Desert roads, quiet towns, wide skies. But under that silence sits infrastructure linked to the most destructive weapons ever made. That is why New Mexico starts this list. At number 9, Missouri. At first glance, Missouri feels far from the nuclear edge. But that is exactly what makes it easy to overlook. Missouri sits near major transport corridors, deep inside the continental interior, and carries long strategic associations through bases tied to long-range strike. The logic is simple. You target not only the trigger, but the network around it. Air bases, movement corridors, maintenance, logistics, command links. Missouri matters less because of headlines, and more because it sits inside the machinery that lets strategic air power move when everything else turns chaotic. It is lower on the list, but in a crisis, lower does not mean safe. It just means others are even more essential. At number 8, Nebraska. Quiet plains, open sky, and one of the most important strategic roles in the country. Because Nebraska is associated with the command side of America's nuclear posture, the part that connects bombers, missiles, submarines, and warning systems into one chain. That makes Nebraska more than a location. It makes it a decision point. If command survives, retaliation stays possible. If command is blinded, delayed, or severed, everything beneath it becomes harder to coordinate in the most important minutes of the war. So Nebraska lands high on the list for one reason. It is not just part of the arsenal. It helps organize the arsenal. At number 7, Colorado. Colorado is where mountains hide some of the most famous hardened command infrastructure in America. The image is almost cinematic on its own. Granite, blast doors, buried systems, the idea of a bunker built to keep functioning while the world above it falls apart. But this is not just Cold War nostalgia. Colorado is tied to the warning and response side of American defense. Monitoring, tracking, communications, space-related awareness. The systems that buy time when time becomes the rarest thing on Earth. And in a missile crisis, even a few minutes matter. That is why Colorado is dangerous terrain in a war most people imagine happening somewhere else. At number 6, Kansas. Kansas does not make dramatic headlines. That is exactly why it fits this list. It sits in the middle of the country's air, fuel, rail, and communications geography. A place built for movement, reinforcement, continuity. In normal times, that centrality feels invisible. In wartime, it becomes obvious. Central states help hold the system together. Tankers, transit, relays, logistics, Rerouting. Kansas is the kind of place planners value because it helps everything else keep moving when the edges start burning. It may not be America's most famous military state, but it is exactly the kind of state a war exposes. At number 5, Washington. Now the list turns unmistakably lethal, because Washington is linked to the submarine leg of America's deterrent. Quiet, survivable, devastating. The kind of force designed for one purpose: make sure retaliation remains possible no matter what happens first. That alone would put Washington near the top. But it goes further. Shipyards, naval support, Pacific-facing logistics, and one of the most economically important coastlines in the country. Washington is where strategic firepower and civilian infrastructure live almost side by side, which creates a brutal truth. If a state helps guarantee the second strike, it also becomes harder to leave off the target list. At number 4, South Dakota. South Dakota is one of those places that feels too quiet to be central, but the northern plains were shaped for strategic depth. Open terrain, long sightlines, bomber access, hardened facilities, and the Cold War logic of distance and dispersion. That logic still matters, not because South Dakota is crowded with famous cities, but because empty-looking terrain has always been useful for strategic systems. Space to spread out, space to hide critical functions in plain sight, space that can absorb pressure the coasts cannot. That is why South Dakota ranks this high. Not because it is noisy, because it was built to matter quietly. At number 3, Wyoming. Wyoming is where the countdown starts feeling truly grim, because Wyoming is tied directly to missile field geography: wide land, sparse population, hardened silos, underground crews, distances so large that disabling everything quickly becomes a challenge in itself. That is the nightmare of Wyoming from an adversary's perspective. You are not looking at one target. You are looking at a web, a dispersed, spread-out grid designed to survive long enough to launch back. And in nuclear strategy, survival for even a few minutes can change everything. So Wyoming is not just exposed. It is built around the exact logic that makes exposure unavoidable. At number 2, Montana. Montana sits closer to the northern approach than much of the mainland. Vast, cold, open, and deeply woven into America's missile posture. It is the kind of state where geography and strategy line up almost too perfectly. Missile fields, command functions, long distances, low density. Montana was almost designed for this role. And that is exactly the problem. In a worst-case conflict, the features that made it useful in peacetime planning make it terrifying in wartime reality. If war ever reaches this threshold, Montana would not be on the edge of the story. It would be near the center of it. So far, the pattern is clear. New Mexico helps build the arsenal. Nebraska helps command it. Colorado helps watch. Washington helps guarantee retaliation. And the northern plains hold some of the systems built to survive long enough to answer back. Which brings us to number 1. The state that combines more than one of those dangers at once. At number 1, North Dakota. If this list has a state that feels almost impossible to leave off the first wave target map, it is North Dakota. Because North Dakota is not tied to just one part of the nuclear system. It sits closer to multiple parts at once. Missiles, bombers, infrastructure built around rapid response. That combination is what makes North Dakota different. It is not simply a node in the chain. It is a cluster, a place where disabling one state could affect several layers of deterrence at the same time. And that is what makes it so dark. If North Dakota survives, retaliation remains terrifyingly real. If North Dakota is hit early, the attacker hopes to buy even a tiny advantage in the first minutes. In nuclear strategy, a tiny advantage is enough to shape an entire war. That is why North Dakota lands at number 1. No cinematic exaggeration needed, just cold strategic logic. And that is the part most people never think about. These states were not chosen because they are disposable. They were chosen by geography, infrastructure, and decades of military planning. Some states hold the shield. Some states are the shield. That is the contradiction at the center of this map. The more important a place becomes to national survival, the more danger it may have to absorb first. Not because it failed, because it matters too much. In a world war, America's quietest states may become its loudest battlegrounds. So which state do you think would become the most dangerous place in America on day one?